thank you again for coming along. This evening, we're looking back at a week in which there was a remarkable number of changes and changes of scene because of the transition team of President-elect Donald Trump. We're in an extraordinary moment for looking at the environment and for the climate in particular, because every day there's a new kind of revelation. Last week we looked for a bit at this whole question of who was going to be nominated, who had been nominated, and who was about to be nominated for positions like the Interior Department or the EPA, or for that matter, for anything having to do with climate, like the Secretary of State, for example, responsible for negotiating international agreements on climate accords. Well, a lot of those questions were half answered this week with the naming of several key people. And we need to keep that in mind as we look forward to what kind of policies we could probably expect from the new administration. In addition, there were several major international problems, you might say, or crises evoked by the transition team and the president-elect himself with a series of tweets and diplomatic awkward situations, you might say, in his transactions with the president of Taiwan and the signals he was sending, whether he knew it or not, to China, as well as what happened then in the Middle East with, in effect, the Russian occupation of Aleppo. That is to say, the Syrian government's official recapture of Aleppo with the serious Russian military support, notably in the bombing campaigns, all of which happened with relatively no comment from the president-elect, and represents a big reversal in the kind of stature that America had with its support of Syrian rebels in the northern part of Syria. So all of this is really quite complex, swift, and seemingly grandiose in its scope in just 1 week. So this week we're going to look a bit at what all of this encapsulates. Some people have referred to it, notably a Harvard professor, as a kind of clash of civilizations between the US on the one hand and the West in general, and the East, and in particular Russia and perhaps China as well. But others have begun to look at it not so much as the clash of civilizations, but the crash of civilization as we know it, because of the kinds of appointments that have been made in this last week. I mean, let's take a look, because just last week we heard of a rumor that became realized during the week. So we're going to look at the clash of civilizations, question mark, or the crash of civilization. What happens when the rule breakers become the rule makers? This is pretty interesting, because last weekend we had heard in the program here that the president was considering a new Secretary of State. But it didn't go very far at the time. It's quite interesting that what was at the time considered just a possibility came in fact to be true.
Donald Trump has still not chosen his Secretary of State, but new media reports say he's considering 2 additional candidates: ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson and former ExxonMobil CEO Lee Raymond. ExxonMobil is the U.S.'s largest oil company. It's currently being investigated by a handful of attorneys generals following revelations that for decades the company covered up its own scientific findings linking rising carbon emissions to dangerous climate change.
Right. Its own findings revealed this back in the 70s and 80s, and the CEOs kept it quiet. Lee Raymond previously, and Rex Tillerson himself. Well, as it turns out, during the course of this week, Rex Tillerson, as of the 10th of November, was named as the proposed U.S. Secretary of State by the new President-elect Trump. So it's very interesting to look at this whole posture. Now, a Secretary of State who is the CEO of the U.S.'s largest petroleum company, one might add the world's largest petroleum company. As that news story pointed out, attorneys general of several states are investigating ExxonMobil for allegedly lying to government regulators, its own stockholders, and the public at large about what it knew about the importance of CO2 as a driver of climate change during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's pretty staggering because even though it seemed to have known a great deal, it was going ahead with fantastically ambitious expansion plans.
Welcome back. ExxonMobil Chairman and CEO Rex Tillerson told me today that his company plans to begin more than 20 new global projects in the next 3 years. Investments expected to add 1 million barrels of oil a day to the company's volume. At an analyst meeting here at the New York Stock Exchange, the CEO of the largest oil company said he would spend $20 billion to do so. The comments sent the stock up. As you can see, it finished at $71.57, up nearly 1%. Mr. Tillerson downplayed worries about oil shortages around the world. After speaking with Wall Street, Mr. Tillerson sat down with me, and I began by asking him to highlight what he told analysts in a First on CNBC interview.
Well, we talked a lot about our investment portfolio opportunity. We talked a lot about what sets ExxonMobil apart from our competition as we look at any number of metrics. But in particular, if you just want to look at the financial metrics, the gap between ExxonMobil's performance and most of our competitors has been growing for some time, and 2006 was a continuation of that gap in terms of performance for ExxonMobil over others. So we talked a lot about why that occurs, how we've been able to make that happen, and what the future holds in terms of our ability to continue to provide the kind of shareholder returns that we have been able to provide.
Let me ask you a little about how things have changed over the last 2 years or so for your company and in fact your entire industry. It does seem that governments around the world have become more hostile toward American or foreign oil companies. You've got, handing over production in Venezuela to the government. You've got Russia not wanting Exxon or anybody else, frankly, owning leases there. Even in this country, you've got some challenges. So tell me how you're dealing with a new world in terms of challenging governments.
Well, I think in terms of our dealing with governments in today's environment, it places even a higher premium on the kind of value that a company like ExxonMobil brings to those countries as they consider ways to develop their natural resources. Obviously, they have a lot of choices available to them, and at this kind of a price environment, oftentimes some choices may look more attractive than they would in a different price environment. So we make the case around our technology, our project execution know-how, our cost structure, and creating more value for the country out of their natural resources over the life of that resource than others are able to bring.
Well, you can get the idea here. A CEO that's creating more value for the countries concerned. This is back 10 years ago, in 2006, when oil prices were low, and the idea was that there were competition between a number of different firms. Well, that competition has declined a bit because ExxonMobil has emerged as even a more dominant player in the scene, and in fact has been encouraged to do so by a whole number of different consultants and the like Danny Yergin, who've understood the global carbon markets and basically given advice to big operators like Putin and others. But in any of these calculations, where have their concerns been for the impact of what they're selling? Either the consultants like Danny Yergin or the CEOs like Rex Tillerson have expressed no interest whatsoever in curbing the emissions of carbon. And in fact, as you can see, Tillerson admits that Exxon threatens the human race, but sees real corporate advantage. you addressed the Council on Foreign Relations in this regard, and it's really quite extraordinary when
Now, so my question,
a member of the Council of Foreign Relations asks a question about climate change. Tillerson's response is very, very revealing.
since we all know this knowledge, we're a little in denial of it. You know, if we burn all these reserves you talk about, you can kiss future generations goodbye. Now, maybe we'll find a solution to take it out of the air, but as you know, we don't have one. So what are you going to do about this? We need your help to do something about this.
Well, let me say that we have studied that issue and continue to study it as well. We are and have been longtime participants in the IPCC panels. We author many of the IPCC subcommittee papers, and we peer review most of them. So we are very current on the science, our understanding of the science, and importantly, and this is where I'm going to take exception to something you've said, the competency of the models to predict the future.
Okay. Worried about the competency of the models.
We've been working with a very good team at MIT now for more than 20 years on this area of modeling climate, which, since obviously it's an area of great interest to you, you know and have to know the competencies of the models are not particularly good. Now, you can plug in assumptions on many elements of the climate system that we cannot model, and you know what they all are. We cannot model aerosols, we cannot model clouds, which are big, big factors in how the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere affect temperatures at surface level. The models, we need, and we are putting a lot of money supporting people and continuing to work on these models, try and become more competent with the models. But our ability to predict with any accuracy what the future is going to be is really pretty limited. So our approach is we do look at the range of the outcomes.
Now, we cause irreversible and widespread damage, but he's looking at the range of outcomes and seeing, in effect, how he can maximize profit.
And try and understand the consequences of that. And clearly there's going to be an impact. So I'm not disputing that increasing CO2 emissions in the atmosphere is going to have an impact. It'll have a warming impact. How large it is what is very hard for anyone to predict. And depending on how large it is, then projects how dire the consequences are. As we have looked at the most recent studies coming out in the IPCC reports, which I've seen the drafts, and I can't say too much because they're not out yet. But when you predict things like sea level rise, you get numbers all over the map. If you take what I would call a reasonable scientific approach to that, we believe those consequences are manageable.
Already affecting countries all over the world.
They do require us to begin to exert or spend more policy effort on adaptation. What do you want to do if we think the future has sea level rising 4 inches, 6 inches? Where are the impacted areas, and what do you want to do to adapt to that? And as human beings, as a species, that's why we're all still here. We have spent our entire existence adapting.
Okay, we're going to be able to adapt. No cutting back on carbon usage. We're just going to have to do the research on how to adapt. Well, it's pretty staggering when you see that he admits that we're up against it, that no question the continued warming is going to be catastrophic, but we got to do more research on it. Now, this is what is happening as his shares go through the roof, company profit goes through the roof, and global warming goes through the roof. Now, the CEOs of the company have been told this by their internal scientists for decades. And this is what's coming out, because the Rockefellers, the descendants of John D. Rockefeller, who founded the biggest oil companies in history and are the origins of ExxonMobil's wealth, are now suing ExxonMobil for their lack of attention and public responsibility. So we discussed this last week on Point. Take a look.
From WBUR Boston and NPR, I'm Tom Ashbrook, and this is On Point. The world's largest oil company, ExxonMobil, has come under fire for hiding climate change research and confusing the public about the fairly terrifying facts. Now the company is accusing its founding family, the Rockefellers, of masterminding a conspiracy against it by funding investigation of its record and encouraging attorneys general to investigate ExxonMobil's past and present statements on climate change. The stakes here? The future of a giant company and of the planet.
The future of a giant company and of a planet. That's what's staggering. It's not just the profitability of a particular company here, but the future of the planet that's at stake. And just this last week, that became all the more dramatic as the CEO of this company is now being put forward as the proposed Secretary of State of the entire country of the United States, right? In a world situation where we're having to negotiate with others about the future of the planet. Hand it over to the CEO of the largest fossil fuel company in the world. Maybe a big mistake in the process of occurring. We're going to have to keep a close eye on it, but just listen to the tone of the exchange.
This hour on Point, we hear from the fifth-generation Rockefeller leading the charge and from ExxonMobil firing back. You can join us on air or online where this conversation is always on. Is it ironic or right or both that the Rockefellers would be in the thick of this? And what's the right outcome here? Join us anytime at onpointradio.org or on Twitter and Facebook at onpointradio. We'll go in just a moment to the head of the Rockefeller Fund and to ExxonMobil. But first, let's look at the Trump transition on the energy front and who's on the shortlist for Secretary of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and more. Joining me now to do that from Washington, Darius Dixon, energy reporter for Politico. He covers the Department of Energy. Darius Dixon, welcome to On Point.
Hi, Tom.
So here we are. The Trump team is fleshing out when it comes to energy and the environment. What does the leadership of the transition team look like, and what do we see shaping up in terms of who's likely to fill these critical roles when it comes to future energy policy?
Well, very interestingly, Rex Tillerson was not nominated for head of the EPA or head of the Interior Department, but for Secretary of State. You really ought to follow that debate, because Secretary of State is going to have to deal with other countries, right, which have already expressed their anger at the extractivism that has taken over each one of their countries, whether it's in Africa or Latin America or throughout large portions of the Middle East. Extractivism has been the dominant U.S. relationship with these areas, and they're starting to call for climate justice at this point. An equal share, at least, if not a controlling share, in the extracted resources. We can no longer run our country on our energy resources. So companies like ExxonMobil have been going abroad for decades and decades, increasing the American commitment to further militarized extraction. Militarized because local populations are resisting it. And that militarization is a taxpayer concern. The taxpayers are paying for the extractive costs going into the private profits of corporations. It's been apparent to anybody who's looked at it from a distance for a while.
200 years ago, the activities of humans were just an infinitesimal scale compared to the scale of global events and, natural phenomenon. Now we're so big that it's, we couldn't fight World War II over again. It was fought on gasoline. Much of it was from the continental U.S. The It's all gone. It's depleted. And right now, it's ironic that we're waging war in Iraq using Middle East oil against Middle East people.
It's ironic. Now that's an understatement of the year. I mean, ironic that we're using Middle Eastern oil against Middle Eastern people to extract more Middle Eastern oil. To do what? To fuel more military expansion to extract more oil. We've gotten into a huge positive feedback syndrome where we need more oil in order to run a military that needs more oil in order to run a military that needs more oil. Now, when we come up into confrontation with Russia, with China, whose needs in petroleum and fossil fuels in general are also pronounced, you can see that we're headed for a certain amount of instability here, with a president that no longer, president-elect, has decided no longer to receive military briefings or the national security briefing every morning. He leaves it to his generals, he said, and his vice president, Pence. And he said, they'll warn me if anything really important is happening. There's kind of a hands-off from the president, but a handing off in the backfield to the CEOs of large corporations whose history of interaction with areas in the third world and elsewhere in the Middle East has been extraordinary. And it's very clear to any analyst that we can't continue this without a real conflict with third world areas.
And no matter what politicians say, a central part of the war is petroleum. Now go broaden your view a little bit and ask about all these global trade agreements that are getting to be somewhat controversial. I think that one of the principal motivations behind the U.S. support for those agreements, and its support from both Democratic and Republican Party, is to allow us to get our hands on their resources before they get developed and want to use them for themselves. We want to go to other countries and take their resources to drive our SUVs. One has to look at things in terms of arithmetic. And the interesting thing is that arithmetic and science that sort of goes with it, these aren't democratic. The three of us can't vote as to whether or not there's global warming and have our vote determine whether or not there's global warming. It's happening whether we vote on it or not. And we have to realize that on these big issues, science doesn't care how people vote. It's going its own way, responding to the things that we do, the way we insult the environment and so on. And of course, if we don't stop population growth, nature will. And it'll be the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It'll be disease and war and famine, and that sort of thing.
This is basically what global trade has done. It has allowed for us in the U.S., for example, I'm sitting right here, I'm able to acquire through purchase resources from the other side of the world. And it's the putting together of resources from one part of the world and resources from another part of the world and bringing them to one place that overcomes the limitations of any particular geographic space, that allows for more and more things to be built, more and more complexity. Now the problem is that globalization also means that everybody is now tied in to this ecological overshoot we're in.
That's the problem. Everyone's tied into the ecological overshoot, and some people are putting up a stink against the extractivism. Further, it's clear that those who had the information about climate change lied to the public about it. And that's becoming apparent to a wider and wider group. In the process, the EPA head is being handed over to an oil magnate and sympathizer, Mr. Pruitt. And it's too late to do anything about it collectively. Well, the CEO is relieved to finally find this out. We really dodged a bullet there, says executive. Well, this has in the past been talked about the clash of civilizations, but in fact, it seems like two extractivists, at least in the wall paintings of graffiti in Lithuania, where it's prominent, have indicated that they're basically going to get together on this. And what's at stake is that the human community has to start saying there's got to be a transition beyond fossil fuels, a transition to a sustainable future.